Immaterial is an art exhibition displayed in the McCormick Gallery at Midland College in September of 2021. It includes the work of 3 contemporary artists, Yvette Cummings, E.O. Palmer, and Mica Lilith Smith. While the work of each artist differs radically in subject and appearance, they all express compelling, powerful ideas through physical material. Their works are visually generous, presenting viewers with surfaces rich in color, texture, text, and decoration. But these works also invite a deeper investigation into subjects of individual experience and cultural narrative. We see fabric, paint, paper, furniture, and bobby pins. But while we look, these material things dissolve into the immaterial worlds of memory, societal barriers, conversation, and experience.
So the work is really based off of, in essence, experiences I had as a child and as a child sexual abuse survivor. But that has kind of morphed and changed as I've become a mother of 3 children and really seen how women's bodies, children's bodies are being policed in ways that are very adult and not contextual to children's age. My daughters are usually my models for these pieces, but they're kind of stand-ins for an age group. So when certain events happen to me at an age, or just kind of as a general umbrella of talking about sexual abuse and kind of perception of female bodies. As I've kind of progressed out of telling my own story, now it's much more about the way that kind of the societal rules against women and their bodies, and the way that, from children's dress codes to just the, children at innocent play, and how we as adults put our gaze on that in a way that has nothing to do with them. As I've seen my children grow up and the way that they've had experiences of catcalls at ages 8, 9, 10, I'm really more interested in kind of shifting it towards those types of things and bringing more awareness to that. For me, the patterns really are a way to kind of camouflage spaces. And they talk a lot about memory. So if we think about memory, usually if we go back to a time in our mind, we're really remembering the last time we remembered that. And over a series of times, it gets abstracted more and more and more. And so our sense of depth into our own consciousness, our own memory, is very shallow. And for me, the pattern kind of works as like a razzle dazzle. So it's really kind of, it's not letting you see far in. It becomes very hard for you as the viewer to kind of engage past a certain point. And I think about the ways that we kind of block our own selves of remembering, specifically for my work, traumatic experiences that we may only want to go so far back, and that we might not expand deep into the space or the surroundings. And the patterns kind of provide a way to flatten and abstract that kind of sense of time and depth. So if we think about the piece Mother Don't Worry, we see that the children themselves have patterned dresses, that we have the blanket that's providing kind of the security, and the pattern on the ground plane. And what that does is create this strange, surreal space. And that's part of that memory. We don't know necessarily if it is the children at that spot. For me, is it me telling my story within that space and not really remembering how fully like what was happening in the environment, but only in what I was concerned with. Also with the piece Mother Don't Worry, the materials being used to kind of security and hide the one figure. So, a lot of children have that security blanket, that piece of fabric that has to go with them everywhere. And those types of objects become really important as well for survivors to have that feeling of safety and security. And what I like about that one is this, again, that pattern piece is also revealing this opening. And the environment within which these 2 figures are existing, it's very murky. It's dusk. It's dawn, that time of day. But you see in that opening, it reveals this blue sky, this kind of otherness. And I think if If we think about survivors who are in the midst of an abusive situation, be it sexual or physical or mental, that idea of hope, that there's something more, I think is important. And for me, that kind of is why that is there. It's just like, this is kind of one moment, and that there's growth and change that happens over time. The furniture work is an outshoot of, they kind of have this dual meaning to me. They have a lot of figuration themselves. So sometimes I think of them as stand-ins of figures, especially the my dueling chair piece there, they're ripped, they're guttural, that we can see that revealing of history right there. I started working with furniture by creating a large-scale installation of stacked furniture pieces. And to me, it was really speaking to child pillow forts. And that was a space where bad things happened to me as a child. And, something that for most children is a space of escape and imagination, and you can go and be free. It was not that for myself. You have to have willing participants. So it was a space that not everyone was a willing participant in the play that was occurring. That's how I started working with the furniture pieces. And the ones that are in the exhibition, again, they're much more figurative to me, so that they are still these same objects that hold that heavy meaning for me. And that's where I think that figuration can come into play, is that as these forms are kind of deteriorating, that they're kind of blending together, it reveals those scars, that history, that layering that occurs. You'll see it a lot in these pieces on those bottom portions. And so when you flip them over, there's this revealing of this other space and kind of this other side to that object or that person. And so, I think about even, talking about my own experiences and the work, this kind of shift that happens, and this kind of, it's not an armor, but it's kind of a growth and a change in that new layer of maturity, whatever. So it can play into that there are these other sides and this growth that occurs over time. And that fabric can do that. The Voyeur series really started because I was working on a large piece and was struggling. And as you move into your practice, time becomes very important. And so every hour, especially having children and jobs, becomes very important. Like, you have to make that hour work for you. So I started these smaller scale pieces that really were just a way to kind of, they started out as a way to stop an artist block on a larger piece. And I set up these kind of 3 rules for myself with them, that I knew that they would be collage based, that they would all have the same pattern in the background that would be used over and over again to unify the piece, and that the figures would be all taken from 30s, 40s, 50s child book illustrations. And I was really interested in this, where we sexualize and recontextualize children in their innocent moment. And so I would purposefully, with each image I found, crop it in such a way that these are children playing hopscotch. These are children on monkey bars. These are children having a tea party or sitting next to each other reading a book. And because usually they're cropped, that we don't see their eye level line, or that we don't have the further context of who's next to them or an object that they're playing with, that suddenly they feel very sexual and very like, whoa, we should be doing this or seeing this. And for me, that is that adult experience gaze being put on those children, because those children aren't doing anything that children shouldn't be doing, even though most of us are, not predators in any way. But we have these experiences and we start policing these activities on children before they even understand why we're policing them. And I see that within my own children, where I'm like, you can't wear that to school. You're going to get dress coded. You've got to put shorts under that skirt, all these types of things. And that's because of us adults, not what the children or the other children that they're going to be playing with are thinking about. But that's a way that we do that. And that starts to, particularly I can speak to female experiences, that starts to ingrain on them very young an impression of how they should carry their bodies, how they need to cover up, I've had, some viewers come and be like, oh, I didn't see any of that. And I'm like, to me, that speaks to their own experiences. If they haven't had these types of experiences, they might be able to go right to those 50s quintessential illustrations. But for those who have had that, by eliminating some of those features, I find it to be a way that they can interject themselves into that moment. It might be that they can be like, oh, I remember that happening to me. And so it's made it non-specific in that way that the viewer can relate to those experiences or come to a greater understanding. They might not be aware of how prevalent this actually is. And I think with a small piece like that, getting people to be even closer and more intimate, and then see, often there's a little bit of text, there might be other figures in even more disturbing types of situations. And I think that's where people can go, oh, and then they look at that very flat drawn illustration, and it's kind of that aha moment of like, oh, wow, there is this larger context going on. I think the disturbing nature of it, or that feeling that something is off, can easily be had by anyone coming to the piece, but they're not necessarily going to go as far as I am with where this all started from. And that's okay with me, because I don't think every piece needs to be slapping the viewer in the face of, I'm an abuse survivor, or this is what, I think that we can, in the context of all the work, you start to see how that story is coming about. And with the Mother Don't Worry piece, the fact that the one girl is in the handmade mask, and it's another way of kind of hiding from situations, but it is age appropriate in what would be drawn and what would be worn by that child. I'm okay with them knowing that, there's definitely more to this story, but they don't have to know every detail with every piece like that.
For me, the material isn't sort of the focal point of the work. It's very much about the message that I'm trying to sort of get across. For the last several years, I say last 6 years, I've been working on a series of pieces that are inspired by gates and fences and borders, personal borders, kind of historical borders, emotional borders, and home decor sort of suggesting the inside of our house and how we tend to our home, and how that then relates to sort of who we allow into our home and who sort of stands outside of it. At the end of the day, my work is very much about racial and class structures. Again, this idea of sort of who has the privilege, who has the right, and who doesn't. So my work tends to be right now very, very colorful, very sort of maximalist, very interested in giving the viewer as much as I can, really sort of saturating one's visual space in that way. So I'm always trying to get to the gaudiest, the sort of glittery, gaudy, artificial facade sort of look. I'm very interested in how we construct our world and how we sort of curate our spaces and ourselves. And obviously with Instagram and these social platforms, there's a space to really, put on a facade, or even, it's almost like we're doing a performance. And I think for me, what draws me is, how do I say it? It's like, I'm not interested in the answers. I'm interested in really dwelling in possibilities. And sometimes those possibilities are not binary possibilities. They're not like cinched up with a bow. They're really expansive. So this notion that it would be both imposing and inviting is I feel like that is, I've gotten my point across, that, that it's like this. I always called that piece when I was making them in my pretty small studio at home. because I made the panels each, and they became these, like, I called them my bugs, my big, like, bugs just looming in my life. And with all the cut work, it's like, it's sort of fanciful and light and airy, but it's also dark and mysterious and physically, large. So I'm interested in the viewer having this experience that they're like, it's almost like a forest, or a fence or a guard or some sort of gate that is, essentially made out of paper and very light and can be easily ripped. So I love those two sort of opposites, like when two things that are seemingly opposite exist together is really intriguing for me, and drives my interest in making artwork. It unfolds like a good book. It's like we can read and reread and reread, and it unfolds depending on where we're at in our lives. I think that to me is really profound. I think if I'm being honest with you, I think my makeup, my physical makeup of being a Black woman, having a white mother and a Black father, that really sort of set the stage for me to understand dualities, and also kind of a really expanded way of living in the world, that we're not one thing or the other. We're sort of made up of millions of things. And what I believe in my heart to be, that there's not a fixed definition. I always respond to the shadows. It's like, again, it extends beyond the piece, the material part of the piece. It extends beyond that and sort of goes to another space. Very intriguing to me, really a very beautiful part of the work, I think, is the shadow. And also this, idea of what a shadow is, that sometimes a shadow, we fear it. Sometimes a shadow references kind of another interpretation of something. I look at shadows that the clouds make a lot on water. I've always been interested in that. My first bobby pin cloud I made maybe 10 years ago now. What I wanted to do was sort of reference hair care salons, particularly Black hair salons, but I didn't want to use hair because I feel like Lorna Simpson just did such a great job. And I had used it before, and I just felt like it was like a trope, like one more Black woman artist using hair, which is great. I mean, I respect all the folks that have used hair. I think it's a beautiful medium. But I wanted to like reference hair without using hair. I wanted to reference adornment. Again, gaudy, something really maximalist, obsessive. I wanted to reference all of those things. So the bobby pins became sort of like drawing. For me, those pieces are very much about a drawing. And so I was really playing with the composition, playing with shapes of clouds I had seen. The wooden part of those that the bobby pins are on, they're all merging of photographs of clouds that I took and other adornments like earrings or bracelets. And I sort of fused those shapes together, had them cut out, and then sort of used those as the canvas to then adorn with the bobby pins. So those pieces too, they're smaller, they're on the wall, they're the little ones, they're just like really cute, and I have some nice hardware in there. So it's almost like they're sketches. It's almost like, as I said, they're like drawings for me. In my quest to sort of make work that you may like it or not like it, but I wanted to have a presence either way, I use gold paint lavishly. I really use it a lot. And I think part of that is, again, getting back to the gaudy, the glitzy, the glitter, the over the top, very inspired by drag queen culture, really, really interested in the bigness, the largeness of something, of a personality or a space. That's just very intriguing to me. But it can also be very cheap and humble, and you can break a cheap gold earring. So I think those two things are important to me. With the fence, I wanted something darker, dense, and more like if you're looking at a muddy river or a muddy pool, and you see, it's like, you know how when something's still, it's a little more ominous. So I wanted that sort of feel for that piece. I wanted something dark and almost brooding. And the purple was just like something glimmering, something sort of coming to the surface a little bit underneath all of this dark, black, glittery kind of, almost like tar or heavy iron, like that sort of, the gates close, those heavy wrought iron gates close, and who's sort of behind the wrought iron gates and who's in front of those wrought iron gates. I think a lot of times it comes down to sort of what makes sense for the idea and what I'm struggling with. So for example, I started feeling, I had like a midlife art crisis a few years ago because I was making all this work out of wood. It would go out to a show, it would come back, and then it would sit in my garage. And I just started thinking about the earth, and I'm a maker. That's what I do. I make things. And I started thinking, okay, how can I'm still going to leave a footprint. I know that, but how can I minimize that? How can I make things a little lighter? How can I make things that take up less space, but still have the physical power I want them to have? So that sort of led to the paper, the cut paper, and the paint. I consciously in the studio work on letting go. I want to be scared. I want to be challenged and pushed in the studio. I want every day to go in there and get a little frustrated. I don't necessarily need to know what the work is going to look like when it's quote unquote finished. So that's sort of a personal challenge for me, that I let go of control because I need to in life in general.
The themes within my work touch on trans female origin stories. The emphasis of that work early on was really placed on arriving at womanhood as a trans woman, and like, what is that, right? And I think often of just being a trans woman who lived in the South for so long, and that in itself really colors the way that you think not only about womanhood, but about like how to arrive at this like idea of womanhood that can like land you in this feeling of safety. And I think so often about how like safety is really just sort of like it's a concept. It's something that like so many of us really kind of take for granted when we think about our physical safety as people. For instance, the way that I move through the world is people often don't know until I speak or until I like, and in whatever way, there's like something that gives that away. And then I notice there's sometimes, not always, sort of a shift in how I'm perceived within that space or how safe I feel within a certain space. The earlier phase of that work, and I'm speaking mostly to the digital images that are printed on satin and chiffon, were really kind of based on that. As the work grew and as I sort of lived in my skin longer and learned more about myself, my work began to sort of take this path in evaluating the relationships among trans women and men, specifically men who are pursuing trans women in whatever sense. Kind of like the common denominator has been this sort of like inability for men to be able to sort of speak to this, to speak to like a trans woman's safety and to advocate for us in like a real way. It admittedly is it's a conversation that I think a lot of people really don't know how to place themselves within, but it's something that so many women like me are like taking head on. My work conceptually sort of centers on a combination of those things. It sort of covers identity, but then it also really speaks to the really sort of personal aspects of like womanhood and intimacy and relationships, but then sort of adding that layer of like, well, what is all of that when you're a woman of trans experience? How do those facets shift and change? How do those dynamics change, more importantly? I think so often there's like an expectation of like trans women to make their work all about their transness. And I think with that, it just becomes really like I love gender as a concept in art. I'm really drawn to that. I think many of my favorite makers and artists really kind of center those concepts within their work. But I think for me specifically, I'm arriving at this place where I want to speak to something that I think is more personal. Not that gender isn't personal, it's super personal, but I think I want to speak to something that has more of a universality upon people sort of walking up to it and viewing it, but then sort of hitting them with that extra layer of content in regard to like, well, who made this work and how is that informing the way I'm looking at it now? Like, I'm not trying to change people's minds because I recognize that likely isn't going to change anyhow. What I would like for the work to do is just to sort of create a moment where I think people can recognize something that is so universally human and shared in a lot of aspects, but then when they're met with who has made the work and whenever they delve more into perhaps like the statement or the imagery, like a lot of the imagery within my work, I use this word with like a lowercase c, but like collage, I think about sort of the power of collage and layered imagery and how layered imagery can also enable a person to arrive at a more layered understanding of the work. Like where are we starting when we're first viewing an image, but then when we're delving into that further and further, how does that understanding shift or change or deepen? And I think if there's anything that I hope for to happen within my work, it's for that. It's for that, like that initial viewership and then that depth of like looking for something else and wanting to find more. And I think that's why in many of the works I have, like text makes its way in. How you feel? That was sort of like a snippet of text that I had with someone in regard to them like kind of backpedaling whenever I brought up being seen with me or their lack of initiative of wanting to be seen out in a public space with me and how insulting I felt that was. And they're like, well, if that's how you feel. And I'm like, well, it's not a matter of me feeling, it's a matter of, this is kind of where you are. And I'm underlining that this makes me upset, So I think like for me, it was a very like intimate relationship and for a while, a very kind of like public relationship, but it just got to a point where I started to sort of notice this sort of like shame on his end. And I began to sort of question it and sort of like an ethos that I've learned to sort of live by is like, your shame is not my shame. But I think that's where like I'm also really drawn to like what text does is I think when you break it down and you extract certain parts of it and use only certain parts of it, it carries this sort of enigmatic quality that again sort of like adds to the layer of the work. And there are other pieces I've made where the text is far more abstract and more difficult to read, and you have to really spend more time with the pictorial space to really kind of get a sense of what it's saying in the midst of everything. So for me, I think there's something about that that's really engaging, in the way that I kind of think about like words and text or like conjuring words, like a word that sort of has a power all of the images that I pull are images that I hold on my phone. It's something that I've this is like so nerdy. Something that I've started doing. I have a separate phone that's just for collecting like more and more images. So I carry like 2 phones with me. But like I think what I like about that is that I have like my phone that I use on a day-to-day basis that of course also holds images, but to have something additional that I think can at times like hold more personal imagery that can sort of like mine all of that for me. I think of that as sort of like a bank that sort of like holds those ideas, and it's somewhat diaristic inherently, but I began a few years back. I was taking fragments from paintings that I made and I was like scanning them and building them through collage via Photoshop and arriving at these compositions, and began to kind of ask myself, well, what would happen if I had these printed, this sort of like harder, more abrupt imagery being printed on something that was like really soft and airy and flowy, like that visual contrast. That became an interest of mine. And then through that, like it began to be less about that specifically and more about arriving straight at the source of like these like photographic images and how those could carry the content, I think, even more effectively than this more sort of like verging on like non-objective stuff I was making at the time. And there was something about having images too that I could like pull directly from and edit and warp. One thing that really draws me to this process are like the malleability of digital images. You know, how they can really be sort of like transformed or shaped by that image being accompanied with another image, whether it's superimposed, whether it's transparent. But I began to kind of think about how that could really add to the layers of the work conceptually. And I remember being really galvanized by that. It like opened everything up, like the way that I was thinking about drawing, the way that I was thinking about painting. It's like once I started doing this, all of it began to make more sense. Whereas before I was doing this, one thing that I would often run into is like, well, how on earth am I arriving at this imagery to this very specific conversation I'm wanting to have? Doing that without photographic imagery was next to impossible. Like I had to really kind of think logically about, well, what is it that I want this work to say? And like, what is going to act as the most effective vehicle for making that happen? I don't know. I think the work over time has really begun to carry on a number of conversations as opposed to being central to just sort of like one idea or one topic. But I think collage has really allowed for that. I think without that sort of layered application and practice to the ways that I understand and embrace imagery, I think it would be hard for me to have the conversation extend beyond what it once was in the beginning of the work. The material that I use, I find that there's something inherently romantic and honest about what satin and chiffon do as materials. I think they both have a lot of flexibility, yet at the same time, they have a lot of limitations. And I think there's something about that push and pull for me that's really lovely and sort of drew me to sort of arriving at wanting to use those materials to sort of hold the images that I made, you know, and like hanging them in sort of like a drape formation. There isn't a whole lot of, I didn't want the emphasis to be so much about like how dynamically they were hung or how dynamically the material was sort of worked with. I wanted it to be more about like the image and how the image was being housed by this really delicate fabric. I think the thing I really love about the drawings and the reason why I feel like they fit with like the other work is even the works on fabric, I view them as sort of like a conversation that involve drawing and painting inherently. And arriving at the fact that like drawing and painting in themselves as acts hold so much plurality. There's a very specific physicality to drawing that satiates something within me, but I think also inherently connects to working with like something haptic and touchable like fabric. I really kind of enjoy the push and pull and the contrast that kind of happens with like these square format ink and graphite drawings that are, I think, perhaps content-wise a bit faster to land upon. Whereas I think the works on fabric, I think, involve a little bit more time and more seeing. If young trans people or any trans people are like seeing my work, they at least have the sort of knowingness, like, yeah, I can do that. I can make a body of work and have it shown in a space. Of course I can, like, and I deserve that, like as a trans woman, I deserve things. So I think like, that's something I'm really on board with too. It's just like trans women recognizing that they deserve good things.